This is a public service announcement from Nic Cage. I really want you to go see my new film, Mandy. Mandy stars me as a disgruntled logger who loses his marbles over the fact that his girlfriend is basically burned at the stake by a crowd of rowdy Jesus people, blown out of their minds on LSD. In the course of this film, I make my way into the underworld, where, like Arnold in End of Days, I take on Satan himself with a battle axe. Maybe a little bit of cinema verite. Imagine Dante meets Hellraiser, meets Evil Dead, meets Twin Peaks. That's what you're getting in this film. And there's really nothing like it. I do have a penchant for the Gnostic and Neoplatonism, if you're not aware. The film reminds me of the time I tripped acid and looked into the eyes of a cat for an hour. And there I saw the meaning of all reality and existence. I also saw the end of the world and my own personal doom. So stay tuned for this analysis of Mandy. Thank you, Nicholas, for that beautiful introduction. This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. I want to talk to you about Mandy. Wow, what a wild, esoteric ride that was. Definitely one of the craziest movies I've seen. Now, let's look at analyzing the film. First, we have the protagonist. The Nicolas Cage character is a logger, and his name is Red. And I think that right away we're going to picture the Mars symbology, the idea of blood, of warfare. Nergal, Mars, is the god of war. And Nicolas Cage is going to go on a revenge tirade like none other. The film is basically Evil Dead, Army of Darkness meets Hellraiser meets, if you've seen the old cartoon Heavy Metal, meets Twin Peaks, right? The darkest. This is, if Pinhead had a nightmare about David Lynch in Twin Peaks, inside the nightmare of Laura Palmer as she's being killed, inside the nightmare of the Evil Dead. This is a descent into pure madness. King Crimson begins us, I think, the opening song. And Crimson, the usage of color in this film is prevalent. The reds, the blues. And again, the red, I think, evokes that idea of Mars and warfare. We hear Reagan on the radio, and Reagan is talking about the moral majority, that kind of 80s false evangelical fake notion that people fell for at the time, that Reagan represented some sort of vaguely Christian veneer, that all of which is ultimately, I think, correctly been seen to be hollow. That was essentially a Pentagon, CIA, fake right-wing type thing. The Falwell, Jerry Falwell, moral majority type stuff. And Nicolas Cage turns off that radio. He doesn't want to hear that. So we have the representation of the anti-establishment, kind of a reclusive, middle-class couple who appears to be recovering from his alcoholism and maybe some traumatic experiences she's been through, a rape or abuse or something worse. And this is what we see in her dream images. She has these kind of evocative dream images that are foreshadowing for what happens in the rest of the film. She sees a dead deer. This, I think, represents the sacrifice that she's actually going to become. She's going to become the unwitting sacrifice here. As I said, I think this film is almost like if Nicolas Cage stepped inside a 1980s death metal album cover and it came to life. That's what this movie is. They're in the Shadow Mountains. They're in the shadow of death, right? The shadow of, lead me through the valley of the shadow of death, as the psalmist says, right? Psalm 23. They're about to cross over into the other side, or there's been some event, or something has happened that has really thinned the veil between our world and the next, between our world and the afterworld, Hades, or actually, as we're going to see, the underworld. So we're going to see that descent into the underworld theme, the katabasis in Greek literature, that's very prominent. That's what's going on in this movie. Nicolas Cage is going to be like Odysseus. He's going to have to do he's like Virgil in the Aeneid. His underworld trek is part of his hero's journey. But we're not there yet. Now, she's a fantasy artist, I think is the best I could deduce here. What she does is she paints these pictures from these 80s fantasy story, Dungeons and Dragons type stuff. Poul Anderson, that kind of stuff. And she reads a section that mysteriously kind of becomes prophetic. She reads a section that deals with the serpent and the emerald and the green eye of the serpent, and that it's strange and eternal. And I think this signifies in alchemy the emerald tablet, right? This is an alchemical image. And as is usually the case in a lot of films like this, the film itself is an alchemical, esoteric, initiatic journey. Now, by the end of the video, I'm going to give you two possible readings or analyses that I think are plausible. One is the Luciferian reading, and the second is the pseudo-Christian Dante-esque type reading, the Descent into Hades reading. So in the sense that this is his bride, girlfriend, or wife, whatever she is, I think it's his wife, Mandy. She is essentially taken in by this cult. She's kidnapped, brainwashed by the Children of the Ascension, I think is the name of the cult. And this is curious because it's reminiscent of a lot of actual cults going on at that time, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all as a result of the MKUltra experiments, of various CIA programs and experiments that dealt even with evangelicals at times, the Jesus people. There were groups of the Jesus people that were part of CIA experimentation. Now, Dave McGowan, of course, dealt with this, and you can also read my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, where I give you a lot of analyses very similar to what you're seeing right now in this video, where I delve into the films of Hitchcock, Spielberg, Kubrick, and so forth to kind of dissect the symbolism and explain that more esoteric, metaphysical meaning behind these things. Now, they're laying in bed at the beginning, and they discuss the favorite planets that they have. This is curious. So there is a planetary theme that's consistent throughout the story. And she says she likes Jupiter because there's a raging storm, the eye of the storm of Jupiter. And that's actually going to come up later in the film. This is, again, foreshadowing where the Nic Cage character is the warrior of Jove. He's the warrior out of the eye of the storm. And that's strange because he says he likes Saturn. So it's almost like there's a transition in the psyche of the character of Nic Cage after he goes through this tremendous traumatic process to becoming out of Saturnalian influence, which is that kind of human sacrifice under the dominance of Kronos worldview, into a Jupiter, Jove, martial type worldview. Right? He becomes a warrior. He becomes the hero after this, a dark hero after this tremendously traumatic experience where his girlfriend is brainwashed and then sacrificed by this cult. Now, isn't it interesting too that there's this veneer of this hippie cult? Oh, they appear to be these hippies and they love to listen to the Carpenters and they, trip out. And as Nic Cage says, they're a bunch of Jesus people freaks who weren't real hippies, right? They were into like human sacrifice and cannibalism. But they're, interestingly, behind them is a much darker element of this extremely demonic cult of bikers, the Black Skulls. And the Black Skulls appear to be these almost demonically, they're obviously possessed, but they almost seem to have a little bit of like demonic power in the sense of supernatural powers. Like, when he wrecks into that one guy that he shot with the arrow, his truck flips over. It's almost like that guy was like, made of, I don't know, adamantium or something. Like he can't be moved. And when he fights with these entities, these beings, they seem so possessed that they love pain. They don't feel the pain. And the Sage character, the old black guy in the trailer, he explains that preternatural, they almost have supernatural powers. Now, she mentions his wife, Mandy, before she's kidnapped. She did mention as well that she was traumatized. Her dad made her and a bunch of her friends murder a bag of baby starlings. So we wonder, was she already prepped for this kind of cult work? Was the cult leader maybe friends with her dad? Or we don't really know. I'm just speculating. But the cult leader spots her and immediately wants her in the cult, Jeremiah, which is interesting because there was a cult leader in the X-Files named Jeremiah, but he wasn't a bad guy. He was a good guy. So the planets that they like signify the kinds of imagery and symbolism and journey that's going to come in the rest of the film. And as I said, in Orthodox theology, for example, we have the doctrine of the descent of Christ into Hades and the preaching of the gospel even to the dead, that is, all of the dead before the coming of Christ, both the Jews and the Gentiles. They heard the gospel when Christ descended into Hades and effectively destroyed the power of death in the resurrection and ascension. And so you could read the story in that way as well, where there is a kind of Christological element of redemption, of victory over the destruction of these demonic entities and the destruction of the cult leader, who is a kind of Antichrist character, isn't he? I mean, he has a lot of Christological elements, but he's obviously a fake. When he captures Nic Cage, he explicitly says that he is the better Jesus, because Jesus failed at, he didn't offer somebody in his place. And they offer the way that this cult has the powers that they do, that they offer the humans to the Black Skull possessed biker gang, more like, you're thinking Hell's Angels, more like Hellraiser's angels. I mean, literally, some of them look like Pinhead. And they also supply the cult with LSD, apparently, from a chemist. They work together with this chemist who gives this extremely potent, tainted, weird LSD drug to the Black Skull's biker gang. And this is interesting because, if you read my book, if you read Dave McGowan's Weird Scenes Inside the Can, you know that a lot of the biker gangs in the 60s and ones that hung out with the Rolling Stones, they seem to have had these kind of weird government connections, and they seem to be working at the behest of larger powers. And a lot of the hippie people, Jesus people, they were, as we said, kind of the front or the shell facing for very nefarious, much darker elements, more demonic, satanic type elements, or Luciferian type elements, right? We think of the Process Church and Manson and that kind of stuff. This movie evokes that. And if you've watched any of my interviews about Manson, I talk about the possibility of CIA connections there as well. And so really it's a quest for the serpent's eye. And the serpent's eye in the dreams that she has, these prophetic dreams that both the Mandy character and the Nic Cage character have, the serpent's eye is found in the carcass of the dead Nic Cage character at one point, right? Nic Cage becomes a kind of beast, and the serpent is within him, the serpent's eye. And so, in a way, you could also, as I said, read it not as necessarily the Christological, but more of the esoteric kind of dark figure of a Luciferian anti-hero, right? A kind of a Donnie Darko type anti-hero could be another way to read this. And so it's actually Nic Cage who becomes the strange and eternal pseudo-deity at the end. He takes over, and this would explain why he says, "I'm your God now," to the Antichrist type character, the false prophet type character at the end. But it's interesting that, again, you have mentioned the horn of Abraxas. This is what summons the Black Skull's demon cult. This comes out of a lot of esoteric and hermetic ideology. It goes back to ancient Egypt. And this was a Gnostic deity. This was the belief that the real deity, the real God of the universe, was this Abraxas, this kind of two-headed, two-faced Gnostic type deity. And that, I think, signifies, something powerful here that may support a more Christian reading of the film, is that if they serve Abraxas, these deities, you could read it as a Luciferian background to a lot of these cults, to a lot of the hippie type stuff, a lot of the satanic movements of the 60s and 70s, because it all harkens back to that period, right? The 60s, 70s countercultural revolution, which we know was not really authentic, which was directed by the Pentagon and so forth, and the CIA. Or the Horn of Abraxas, as I said, could signify, in a Gnostic reading, a Luciferian type reading of the movie, that the entities, these demonic entities, are thinking that they serve God or the true God, when in fact they're actually serving some false archon, some Gnostic demiurge, Abraxas. And so the cult, of course, has their Heaven's Gate type ascension. Oh, we're going to have ascension. Just do whatever I say. Be sure to be my proper sex slave, and then you'll ascend, the typical, right, cult MO. And instead, it's actually a satanic human sacrifice cult, right? And so they derive power by offering to these demonic, semi-demonic, possessed black skulls, human sacrifice and cannibalism, right? So we're, in one sense, I like the fact that, you know, we're seeing what really goes on at the elite levels of stuff. This is coming out in mainstream news, even, right? And the movie does not hold back. So if you have a weak stomach, you don't want to watch this movie. There's some pretty yucky scenes throughout, but at the same time, it's such a wild film. It's like, you know, there's nothing like this. It's kind of a trip on its own. It's like Dante on acid is a way to describe this movie. Now, I did want to mention when they get to the mouth of this underground base where the chemist is producing his super LSD, which produces like completely possessed demonic nutballs. This kind of vindicates my analysis of LSD and the history of this kind of stuff, doesn't it? Right? Like how I've talked about that I think it's not the best idea and it leads to problems and can even lead to something like dissociation and possession, which is what the original producers of LSD said. They said it was to induce dissociative states. Aldous Huxley, Abby Hoffman, different MK Ultra related doctors, they all talked about this when they were producing this. And then that's just discussed in John Marks's book, The CIA and the Search for the Manchurian Candidate. So the movie tagline does describe it as a descent into the abyss. So I think that we're supposed to think perhaps that either spiritually or half reality, when he goes underground into this underground base and they find the chemist who's manufacturing the LSD, this chemist is kind of a neutral character. Obviously he's wicked, but he's not really presented as a threat to Nic Cage. He seems to emerge on like this other side, right? He goes to the other side he's basically, I think, in Hades. And this is where he finds the cult in their new compound, and they've erected this giant pyramid structure with a cross, a wooden pyramid cross type structure, which has a hidden underground facility, which could represent, again, the false church, this kind of Antichrist, end times Babylon type scenario of a fake, synthetic Luciferian church. And of course, Nic Cage has to basically ram through all of the bad guys of the cult, almost like it's like a video game at this point where he's like beating each boss of the level. There's the reminiscent scenes that make you think of Ash from Evil Dead, right? He's got the chainsaw. He eventually burns down this edifice. And so we have the destruction of either Christianity, if you have the sort of Luciferian Gnostic reading, and Nic Cage is a kind of Antichrist anti-hero, a Luciferian anti-hero, or this represents a rebellion against the forces of actual Satanism, the destruction of false Christianity, synthetic Christianity, which in fact hides under a mask of hippie fronts, lovey-dovey fronts, right? And secretly they're engaged in human trafficking, mind control, and all kinds of disgusting sex operations. I think you could read it either way, but it's not accidental that you had this pyramidal imagery. And as I said, when he goes to the chemist says, "You are the warrior from the eye of Jupiter, aren't you?" It's almost like he could see into, what they were talking about on their bed when he was laying there with his wife. So overall, an amazing film, a lot of interesting imagery, fantastic cinematography, some really gross scenes at certain points. Don't join the Hellraisers Angels biker gang. Lesson number 1. Nic Cage back in full Cage Rage form. If you enjoyed my analysis, let me know below. And yeah, check out this movie if you're not faint of heart. And you'll see a lot of, I think you'll see a lot of what I talked about is true. Let me know what you think below. Follow, click the like button, share it, and subscribe to Jay's Analysis to get signed copies of my book. Thanks for watching.